Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 2 of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. Tawny Holm, a professor of Jewish Studies and Classics at Pennsylvania State University. In this episode, we discuss the importance of Aramaic language, why Papyrus Amher 63 is so important, unique, and a bit odd, and the difficulties when teaching the Book of Daniel, especially when dealing with the historical inaccuracies of the Persian timeline. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Well, I guess morning for me, afternoon for you. And I just want to start us out by asking you, how did you get into your field?
Well, I earned my Biblical Studies BA from a college in Minnesota, Oak Hills Bible College. And while there, I became interested in studying the ancient Near East broadly and learning more languages beyond Hebrew and Greek. I had good advisors there. They recommended that I write to top universities in advance and connect with scholars about my interests. In the end, I applied to 3 different places and I got accepted into Johns Hopkins with full support. And so I went there. It was a wonderful experience, such a great program. My field and degree, PhD, is in Hebrew, Bible, and Northwest Semitic languages, but the program compelled all students to take multiple languages and to take a 3-year history cycle that covered 1 year each of 3 regions, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant. In my very first semester there, I was introduced to Aramaic, which is what I work on primarily now. But at that time, I took Aramaic and Akkadian for the first time that very first semester, languages which I continued to study in different dialects while I was at Hopkins. And I eventually picked up Demotic Egyptian and started Coptic, and Egyptian language has also been very important to my work. My dissertation ended up being on Biblical Aramaic Daniel, in particular the court tales in chapters 2 through 6. My goal was to examine them in their ancient Near Eastern literary context as a story collection. In the course of that research, I encountered several Demotic and other Egyptian court tales that had never been considered before, together with other ancient Near Eastern court tales, let alone set alongside biblical and parabiblical Daniel. So that was very interesting to me. And along the way, because of that, I began to be interested as well in Aramaic literature generally in Egypt, such as that from Elephantine and Saqqara, as well as the Aramaic tomb inscription at Eshik Fodl in Middle Egypt, and Papyrus Amher 63, which is a long multi-composition text in Aramaic, but written in Demotic Egyptian script. Much of my current work concentrates on Aramaic in Egypt in the Persian period and the era immediately after that. So that's
Such a really awesome, like really diverse, wide range of things that I'm hearing. It's becoming, it's like this great melange of different things. When you were kind of initially in school trying to figure out where you were going to go with all this, did you have an idea that you could take it in all these different directions? Or did you kind of originally go on a path thinking, oh, I'm going to stick to just 1 or 2 things. And then just as you found more things were connected, you were like, oh no, now I have to do this too.
right. Well, I went to Hopkins because it has such a broad ancient Near Eastern program. I was very excited by that, and very excited and stressed by immediately learning brand new languages, Aramaic and Akkadian, in the very first semester. I had had Biblical Hebrew and New Testament Greek before then. But, as soon as I began learning Aramaic and Akkadian, I really realized these were central languages to the ancient Near East. And I was very excited about continuing to read these texts for myself, the history, the culture, etc., of the ancient Near East. So, but then Egyptian was a later add. And then I realized how important that was, in particular to my own work on Aramaic literature, especially that in Egypt.
Yeah. Now, I hope you'll forgive me because I am a classicist, and so I had no experience background or even I didn't even have the option, right, to take Aramaic or sort of delve into that. But I think that just from talking to people sort of outside the field with sort of a cursory knowledge, there is kind of a misconception about where would they have spoken that? Where did they use it? How far did it go? And who I think, especially when you get to the sort of Hebrew Bible stuff, I think the most common thing you would hear just from a random person on the street, right, is, oh yeah, like Jesus and all the people in the Bible would have been speaking this. And so just for me and then for maybe other people out there, can you just like confirm like yes, this is what they were talking, but also did they have different dialects? Like I don't have any familiarity with Aramaic. And so when I go forth and tell people after this conversation, I want to be like, yes, but, or yes, you're right.
Yeah, Aramaic's first written attestations, first text that we have for Aramaic date to around 900 BCE, and it continues to be used, spoken in the modern world. There's modern Aramaic. So there's nearly 3,000 years of attested history of Aramaic. Of course, it's, older than that, older than before we get the first text, but many different dialects over the ages have emerged. Aramaic was the language of a people from Aram, the Aramaeans. There were kingdoms of Aram, there were Aramaean kingdoms in Upper Mesopotamia and Syria at the end of the second millennium BCE. They're slowly conquered and absorbed into the Assyrian Empire by the end of the 8th century BCE. But those Aramaeans themselves get absorbed into the empire of the Assyrians, and some of them were administrators. And the Assyrians realized quickly that the Aramaic language and script was easier to use than the wedge-shaped cuneiform script. And so they continued to use Aramaic as their language to communicate and control the Western provinces. After the Assyrians, the Babylonians decided to continue that practice. Aramaic, continued to be an administrative language. The Persians, of course, famously took on Aramaic as their language of diplomacy and international relations and to control the Western provinces. And Aramaic continues to be used in the region up until the time that Greek slowly begins to take over in the Levant. And still Aramaic continues to be used until the emergence of Islam in the interior. But as a major language. And of course, there's still these communities who kept speaking it, and that's why you have modern communities that still speak Aramaic. And Aramaeans were a conquered people, but their language conquered back. You couldn't get rid of their language. Very important.
I think the more that people tell me, the more tidbits of history that I learn like that make me have a greater appreciation because often, you hear people sort of in the ancient world as it was normal, people get conquered and then kind of they get subsumed. So it's not often that it's something that they had could really sort of punch back and say, you can't get rid of us. We're staying.
Yeah.
So the incredible staying power is definitely super impressive. Now, I want to pick up on one of the things you said, which was Aramaic literary texts. And obviously, we'll get to sort of the papyrus, we'll get to Egypt, but just to almost set the basis again for myself and then for people who also maybe don't know, in a lot of these ancient cultures, writing was kind of reserved for royalty, sort of the upper class, right? And a lot of the sort of poor, lower classes, social classes did not have sort of exclusive they didn't have access to or they just weren't taught sort of writing because it was supposed to be used as an exclusive tool to separate the classes. And so for Aramaic texts, did all social classes have access to the writing, or was it a bit more like in Egypt where no, the sort of higher classes would be able to read and then the sort of lower poor people would just have to have things told to them?
Yeah, our old Aramaic is used in monumental inscriptions, and so that's an educated class. But this becomes a language that everybody begins to use, even if they're not in the administrative classes. You have, especially when you're talking about Egypt, you have just everyday commoners using and writing in Aramaic. We have from especially Tawny of the 5th century BCE. We have lots of letters on ostraca, and they're just general everyday letters from men and women. I'm sending you my tunic, or please hurry and get your boat here and bring me this, that, or the other thing. In addition to more official documents as well on papyrus, and then the literary texts on papyrus. So we have plenty of evidence that there were literate men and women of different classes who were educated and could write letters in the 5th century.
Okay. Yeah, that's that interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of it'll make sense. It's like in my brain it's percolating. So I'm like I have the first thread, so I'm gonna just start with that, I guess, and then I'll figure out how I can connect it to the other thought I had wandering around in my brain. So I guess I'll start with so you worked on if I remember from the beginning, you said you worked on specific papyri, right? Papyrus Amherst 63. So I definitely, before you mentioned it, was not aware of what even that was. And it sounds great and fascinating, especially the part about it being like written in Demotic. So can you just tell our listeners a little bit more about that papyrus? Because it sounds really, really cool.
Okay, it was discovered on the antiquities market, or came to light on the antiquities market in the 1890s, where it was sold to Lord Amherst of Hackney. He was told at the time it was part of a document cache found in a jar at Thebes, but it's radically different from the 19 other documents it was supposedly found with. They're short, they're in Greek and Demotic. This papyrus is long. It's got 23 different columns on it. It is several feet long. It's written on both sides, and it's in Demotic, but it doesn't make sense as Demotic. I think early on in the 20th century, people who looked at it began to realize it was something else. But the first time this was announced was in 1944. A Chicago scholar published a short article about it, Raymond Bowman, saying that this was really Aramaic. It then took another 40 years about before other scholars, an American team and a Dutch team, began to work on it and began to publish some more columns with their early understanding of what was going on, that it was Aramaic. And then there was another hiatus for a while Richard Steiner continued to work on it. He was part of the American team. Richard Steiner is a Semitist. He was working on it with Charles Nims, who had passed away, I think, in the late 1980s, 1988 or something. But Richard Steiner continued to work, and in 2017 published an online transliteration of the Demotic with an Aramaic normalization and then a translation. After that, in 2018, a Dutch scholar who was not part of the original Dutch team from the 1980s, a guy called Karel van der Toorn, an important scholar of Syrian religions. In 2018, he published the first book edition of this. I think his edition is highly problematic for all kinds of reasons, and I have it in press, my edition of the papyrus in a volume for the Writings from the Ancient World series for the Society of Biblical Literature. And that has my interpretation, and I've also written on my interpretation before this book, but this book is in press and it has a full edition of Papyrus Amherst 63. That's the history of the papyrus itself. As far as its publication edition goes, we understand it better than ever now. There are still a few sections where you could go, I don't know. But it's difficult because for the most part, the demotic that's used is used alphabetically. but there are 60 some Demotic words that are used to represent Semitic signs, Aramaic letters, sound segments as well. The issue here is that sometimes there's multiple choices on the papyrus. For example, the Demotic sign for Ryan can represent something else, and the emphatics, the dental emphatics, some of these signs in Egyptian can stand for up to 3 different Aramaic sound segments, so it's complicated.
I think that I love learning about the history of like what is contained within and what document is actually saying. Obviously, very interesting. But I also find it is very interesting to hear the sort of the history of the document itself, because that lends to great questions like when I think about sort of modern translations into foreign languages that might not fit because something about the vocabulary or the syntax doesn't quite work, and it throws the grammar off, is really interesting. And so, from a personal standpoint, I'm just very curious. It's written in Demotic, but obviously you said that didn't fit because it should be Aramaic. And so in the context of using old languages like this, how bad of a sort of fit is it? Is it kind of like if you were, I don't know, taking a French text and then trying to translate word for word, and then it kind of loses its poetry and its meaning? Or is it enough kind of like able to be sort of translated where you're like, okay, like I get what it's saying, but like, oh, that's just a weird word that they're using?
Well, we're helped out a lot by the fact that a lot of it's poetry, and poetry in lots of ancient languages is guided by something we call parallelism. So there's a statement that's relatively short, and then a restatement or an oppositional statement or something like that. And you can see, okay, this is how this, plays against that in relatively short phrases. So we're helped by that as we translate this text. The hardest part, but all of this comes together, deciding what the Demotic is representing in Aramaic, and making those choices based on what we expect it to be, poetically, that something ought to balance in some way. So it all kind of works together as you transliterate and translate.
It's fascinating. I mean, I'm not a linguist, and then philology was not my forte, let's say, in school. So I do find it interesting, how we kind of, handle things like transliterations from different ancient languages, especially when, I like modern languages and it's very different how we do it. Well, not, so different, but yeah.
So some of it's very beautiful, really, and there is a section at the end which has a narrative. I actually haven't spoken about the contents, just how we work with it, and I could tell you more about the contents. But there are 17 columns that are liturgical kinds of poems in praise of deities. Lots of these seem to the different individual compositions seem to focus on the new year, but there's multiple deities, discrete compositions. They may be related to each other, but they're very distinct. Some are praising 1 or 2 deities, others are praising absolutely different deities. So it's really intriguing to have this multi-composition text. And I can say, and this was Richard Steiner's initial opinion from 1991, that this is a New Year's liturgy text, because so many of the compositions have to do with something we think is related to the new year. Not all do. So it's sort of a miscellany. It's sort of an anthology. But those are the first 17 columns. The last 6 columns are this narrative with this exquisite Aramaic. Really, truly. You can't just say he answered and said, which is Aramaic from the Bible or other languages. You have to say he answered and said, addressing so and so. It's an elaborate introduction to speech, and the speech is highly poetic with this lovely parallelism. But it's a narrative, and some of the narrative is carried on without poetry. But it's really this elevated, beautiful, beautiful Aramaic. And the other earlier parts are lovely too, but I'm amazed at the Aramaic of the narrative. The narrative at the tail end concerns historical events in Assyria from the 7th century. And this papyrus dates to the 4th century or maybe the early 3rd. Probably it's 4th century BCE. So all of these compositions on the papyrus are older than the papyrus itself. But the 7th century BCE story at the end concerns historical events surrounding King Assurbanipal of Assyria and his brother, King Shamash-shum-ukin, who was placed by his father as king of Babylon, Babylonia. They are royal Assyrian brothers, and they have a falling out. The brother who's king of Babylonia, Shamash-shum-ukin, revolts against his brother, and this revolt lasts for 4 years, 652 to 648 BCE. We have this story now in this Aramaic version, which includes the sister, a historical woman, Sharua Eterat, sister to both of these men. And in the story in Aramaic on Papyrus Amher 63, she's the go-between, she's the intermediator. She tries to fix the relationship. She travels from Nineveh to Babylon, the city, to talk to Shamash-shum-ukin. And of course, in Aramaic, their names are rendered differently. I won't give you the Aramaic form, but she confronts this brother and says, go accept the overlordship of your brother. And he refuses to do it. But Shuro Eterat, Saritra in Aramaic, she utters a prophetic ultimatum. If you don't do this, then go build a house of sticks and burn yourself. Let fire burn you. She doesn't actually, well, she says, let fire burn you. Let fire consume you and everybody who helped you lead in this revolt and all your kids. The Aramaic version puts her in there. And we know historically she was a very important, powerful sibling. We actually have in Akkadian a letter she writes to her sister-in-law, the Queen of Assyria, telling her, do your exercises, learn how to write like all of us Assyrians know how to write. We have that letter. But what we don't have is evidence on the Assyrian side that she was at all any intermediator between the two brothers. This is something only the Aramaic version from Papyrus Amher 63 has in it. We also have evidence from lots of Assyrian documents that this guy, Shamash-shum-ukin, did die in a palace conflagration. And it's mysterious. The Assyrian documents say the gods did it. But maybe that's a way out of saying an Assyrian killed an Assyrian, or that an Assyrian committed suicide, or whatever. It's the gods did it. So it's very funny the way the Aramaic text works with what we know, so many years later as, historical events. And somebody in Egypt, or somebody who brought this story to Egypt, knows the tradition very well, and either knows Sharua Eterat Saritra in Aramaic, had a part in that, or they place her in the story in the Aramaic version. And as I said, this is really beautiful Aramaic, in particular the narrative at the end of the papyrus.
I mean, it's fascinating, and it's so interesting how, depending on, what version that you're seeing, you'll get sort of slightly different events. And so thank you. This has helped me sort of pick up the loose thread I was looking for, because the next question I'm really going to throw at you really is, when things are written specifically, the kind of the history, or what will become a historical event to a certain location, place, culture, kind of written from whatever perspective that culture wishes to sort of record. Now, when it gets to different time period, later times, as stories become passed down, as they get written down, as territories are sort of conquered, taken over, I know that people obviously change kind of versions of events that suits whatever canon their culture had. And so with your work being so interdisciplinary, I'm going to bring in sort of the Egypt of it all, but now we're going to sort of add in the Persian to it all as well, which is, by the time that, these stories do start to filter down, how significantly do things change? How much would you want them to change? How much do they need to change? If it's like, you have a story that originated somewhere else, you start in Assyria, and then obviously they're neighbors with sort of the Elamites and then the Persians eventually. And then obviously you have Egypt down there, but then Egypt becomes, right, like a Persian satrap. And so things need to change. So by the time you kind of see all this added in, what's going on there? Because I think my first reaction would be, oh man, I could see why you'd want to change some things depending on who's in charge when, but geographically, oh, but that's different. It's fascinating.
What's intriguing to me is this story is famous. It's passed down into Greek, and it's now the subject of various art paintings, Delacroix's Sardanapalus painting, and there are some operas about the Sardanapalus tradition. Sardanapalus is the Greek or Latin form of this name of the king who dies in a palace conflagration. But outside of the Aramaic version from Papyrus Amber 63, we have mentions of this king, hedonistic king, in Greek authors from the 5th century. And then we get a standard Greek version from Diodorus, who is saying that he got this from the 4th century Ctesias in his Persica that he wrote, describing events that took place in Persia, or in earlier than Persia, but as he's part of the Persian Empire. So we have this Persian era story written maybe at the same time as the Aramaic version, although maybe the Aramaic version is earlier than its composition, but they don't match up. There's no sister in the Greek or versions that we have of this famous story of a monarch who dies in a fiery furnace, and he was a hedonistic, terrible guy. So that's really intriguing that in Egypt, this story that everybody knew has either the earlier shape, or someone has purposely said, hey, no, we're putting a woman, this historical woman, into this tradition as someone really, really vital, and actually as the hero of the story in her own way. So I don't know what there is. I don't know why these things happen, why a woman drops out who was historically very important, or why she's put back in if she had dropped out and someone knew that. I don't know. These are very complicated things. The papyrus Amher 63 from Egypt, post-dates probably the Persian era in Egypt, which the first satrapy ends in 404 BCE, and this papyrus probably dates to the 4th century, some period in there. And thus it would be a little bit later than the Floruit of the Elephantine community, about which we know a whole lot. The community of Jewish people or Judeans who had a temple to the god Yahweh, the local form of Yahweh, and they were sister community to people on the mainland at Syene. We know a whole lot about the Elephantine community. We have their ostraca, we have papyrus, we have the official correspondence of Arsham that helps us understand that era when there's a lot of Aramaic being spoken, and when you have these mercenary communities in different places, but especially Elephantine and Syene, that are run by the Persians. They're hired by the Persians. But this papyrus dates to just a little bit after that, after the Persian first satrapy has ended. And it has a lot that is, woman friendly. The main deity on the papyrus is the goddess Nanai, who is a Mesopotamian goddess who was worshipped by the Aramaeans. And before this papyrus, we would have thought, oh, Nanai, she's the main Aramaean goddess of the Parthian era. And we know of her from Syria and Upper Mesopotamia. But now this papyrus places her very firmly in Egypt as an object of worship, as a major deity. So just in general, my point here is this papyrus is lovely and odd. It has a goddess as its main deity in much of it, even though it also mentions Yahweh. In the center, there are 3 poems that are in praise of Yahweh, the local form of Yahweh. And then it has this end narrative of 6 columns where it's the woman who's the hero. And, I speculate, is this because Egypt was in particularly a woman-friendly place where women are really well educated, where we know at Elephantine women were administrators? where Gad Barnea, a scholar from Haifa, has recently suggested there was a woman priestess or high officiant because of his own particular reading of one ostracon there. It's I don't know why you have this kind of thing going on in Egypt in Aramaic.
Yeah, I mean those questions are always a mystery, aren't they? And I do wonder a lot. I mean, having studied classics, obviously we always have kind of the Minoan unit, and then they say, yes, this was a very sort of matriarchal society as compared to sort of later places and eras. And so I do wonder how much kind of attitudes towards gender do play into it, because we do have places that are much more friendly toward women and others that just kind of not really. So I wonder if that plays a role in them sort of being like, yeah, let's just drop the woman out of it because we need to sort of just put a much more male sort of emphasis on the tale. I don't know. It's interesting to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, and it's interesting to see that modern scholars, they, as very, much aware as people are now, they still sometimes forget that, okay, we have Aramaic documents with partial names, and they fill in male names as the blank. When, you know what? We have lots and lots of evidence for lots and lots of women in Aramaic documents. So why is it, obviously that a partial name is a man's name?
Yeah, no, it's very true. And especially, it's interesting. I mean, dealing with even the more sort of like biblical stories, biblical context. One thing that has astounded me that I always kind of wonder about is I don't know. You know what? I want to start by asking you, as someone who has Hebrew Bible as part of her professional portfolio, how many questions from like general public people outside of your field do you get about sort of almost like accuracy questions about things like, oh, what's it called? Like the Da Vinci Code, like random popular media things. Does that kind of make your head want to just pop off and go, oh gosh, oh no, another question about this because what did they do to history?
Right. This really only comes up in classes, I think. I don't know. I have lots of friends who are not connected to Penn State. They don't tend to ask me about work or history. I don't know why. Maybe their lives are so much more interesting than mine.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's just, I mean, obviously being in the fields, we're kind of in our bubbles, right? We have our sort of
It's
professional
true.
lives, and then we do try to sort of separate if we can, just so our lives are not completely taken over by the weighty work stuff. But yeah, I don't know, just with I guess how the modern student is, I feel like a lot of ancient history in any context is a lot of meeting students where they'll come into the field. And I find, I'm a reception scholar, so I like to look at what horrible popular media things are people using to get into, any of the ancient fields. So oftentimes it's sort of like a Kingdom of Heaven. I'll get cited for crusade stuff, or it'll be Da Vinci Code for biblical stuff, and then of course you have like 300 for Greek and Persian. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm very sorry. That's terrible that you had to start with something so inaccurate. But it's interesting because I think I had a conversation not too long ago with someone who did want to ask me for some strange reason about Da Vinci Code. I don't really know why, because that's not what I focus on. But they did say something interesting, and they said, even with what that story did, you have this whole sort of fake controversy that Ian McKellen's character will bring up, and he'll talk about the big erasure of Mary Magdalene's story and how this culture didn't sort of like her, and so they cast her out. And I think his character sort of has this grand theory about how she was supposed to be the future of the church, but since there were patriarchal societies who didn't like that, they said, okay, let's just erase her, make her sort of this prostitute character, let's shunt her to the side, and only talk about the male disciples. And so, what we've been talking about kind of brings that to mind. And I'm like, oh my gosh, is that really what's filtering down into our popular media?
Yes, no, I encountered that main example when I teach women in the Bible or gender and sexuality in the Bible, because Mary Magdalene has a key role in the New Testament, certainly, but then she sort of drops out and becomes only this major character in these non-canonical writings. And so you have to imagine she remained important, but then she really gets sidelined. Yeah. And is this prostitute? And then, that's not there in the New Testament. Yeah.
That must be so frustrating.
Yeah, well, it is, but it makes it for a very exciting class, actually, because students are really feel like they're learning something new that's, contrary to whatever they may have heard growing up or in popular culture.
Well, I mean, turning to pedagogy, which is one of my favorite topics, and teaching ancient cultures kind of in the classroom and trying to set sort of expectations to a more realistic place and not so much with all this popular media stuff, which could be very, very wrong indeed. I was gonna say, yeah, so how do you normally handle stuff like this where you might have beautiful Aramaic saying one thing and then that kind of completely contradicts what people are thinking? How do you best deal with that in the context of the classroom?
I think perhaps my most controversial class, if it is controversial, would be my Apocalypse and Beyond course, in which we covered Daniel. Daniel is written half in Hebrew. Biblical Daniel is half Hebrew, half Aramaic. And it has a Mesopotamian setting. Daniel is described as a Jewish exile who's taken by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon to Babylon to live and serve in his court. And then he serves in not only his court, but down to the time of Cyrus the Persian. So that's the setting. That's very much a setting in the 500s BCE. But we have all kinds of clues in the book itself that it was really written during the Maccabean period. So that's the 160s BCE. So much later in the Hellenistic era. But because Daniel speaks to angels and says things that are prophecy, this is a hard part for some students who have a very particular idea of the literal nature of the biblical text. Hard to make that shift and say, oh, okay, so it's 6th century setting for a purpose, but here are the clues that tell you it was written in the Hellenistic period. Sometimes that's a hard thing for people to get to, but you just in a course you're able to build to that point. You're able to show, hey, this is the evidence, these are the clues, and in the end at least you've offered students the opportunity for understanding why scholars think a certain thing. And the same thing is true if I teach other courses on the Hebrew Bible or occasionally on the New Testament. You just have to say, this is where the academic field is now, and here you go, and this is why.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one thing that, you mentioned when teaching on the Book of Daniel that I always find interesting, especially in relation to the Persians, is that I was reading something the other day and I just went, hey, I think that timeline's really off because what they tell you in the Book of Daniel, right down to, the name of the Persian king at the time, it struck me and I was like, oh, that must really be interesting because if you're reading the Bible, learning about it, taking things in context, so if you want to study the Book of Daniel, you're going to be dealing with a set of names that historically, I don't believe it was, I'm terrible with math, but I remember I think I said to myself, that must be at least 400 years off. Is that something that comes up often if you're kind of talking about the Book of Daniel, especially because I know they mentioned Persians in there a lot. And so how much sort of historical timeline resetting do you have to do to go, okay, well, so this is, yes, the Book of Daniel, this is what it says, but also like the timeline is like 400 years off.
Yeah, you use the evidence from the book itself. It calls Darius a Mede, Mede, from the Media, which at one time was its own independent kingdom, but then is subsumed by the Persian Empire. Darius is a Mede in the book of Daniel. No, we don't know of any Medes who were Darius. We know lots of Persians who are Darius. So this is a place where there's a historical inaccuracy on purpose or not on purpose, but perhaps the easiest explanation is that when someone was writing at least the early parts of the book of Daniel, they were hundreds of years distance from the setting that they're talking about, either the Babylonian period of Nebuchadnezzar or Darius or whoever, or Cyrus. And so that's why they're off. With Daniel, the history gets better in the very coded apocalyptic section at the tail end of the book, but it's all in code. You have to decipher that the horrible, abominating guy is Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Fourth, the Syrian Greek king. And we know from history he desecrated the temple, and we know a lot. So it seems like, that's the evil person at the tail end of the book of Daniel. And since it seems to be a lot more accurate than the early parts of Daniel, even if it's in code, that's what is a main key to deciding it was written in a period in which Antiochus IV was around.
Hmm. Yeah, it's one of the things that just always stands out to me and is quite striking. So when people sort of mention Book of Daniel, I kind of go, oh, just by the way.
And we know he died in Persia, but Daniel chapter 11 says he died between the sea and the beautiful mountain or something like that. So wherever you're going to place that, we know historically he died in Persia.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting to see kind of how details are changed and you go, oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. But, I suppose if you don't study if you're not a historian, how do you know?
Yeah, and this is a place where the fact that this prophecy about where he dies is wrong. It makes you think that the book is written just before he dies, so the person doesn't know. But anyway, that's how we date the book to about 164 BCE approximately.
Yeah, I mean, it's super fascinating. These are kind of what I consider this little quirks in history that are sometimes completely missable, but so fascinating when you do happen to catch it. So, what I would like to do though is, I mean, you've mentioned so many interesting different things over the course of this conversation. So, what I do want to give you room and space to do is tell us if we're like voraciously, oh, that sounds interesting. I want to go learn more or find more. Where can we do that? Do you have any other upcoming publications that are either sort of in the review process or coming out soon that you can direct us to? Because I definitely know I would like to.
Well, thanks. As I said, I have this Society of Biblical Literature book in the Writings from the Ancient World series that's coming out, and it has several Aramaic literary texts, not only some from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also these Egyptian literary texts that I've been talking about, including Papyrus Amber 63. That's in press. It's been in press for a while. I'm not sure when it's coming out. But if anyone wants to look at anything else I've written, I have a page, academia.edu page with everything that I've written there. Or if I'm not allowed to by a publisher to have the whole thing there, they could contact me for anything that just has a first page or something. I am also currently working on a re-edition of the Aramaic text of a tomb in Egypt, the tomb at Eshek Fodl. It probably is a text about a guy called Inaros, but not the well-known Inaros of the Persian period, who fought the Persians. That happens in the 400s BCE. This Sheikh Fadl inscription talks about an Inaros who was a historical guy during the Assyrian invasion of Egypt in the 7th century BCE. And this inscription on the tomb wall, very lovely narrative about Assyrian events again. Apparently the Egyptians and Aramaeans in Egypt love to talk about the Assyrian conquest of Egypt because they hated it so much. They didn't seem to hate the Persians as much as they hated the Assyrians. But anyway, I'm working on a reedition of that. That's probably in a slower process. And then in general, I work on Aramaic literature texts and have various things about that coming out. So yeah, that's where you can look for my work on these things.
Well, I definitely am going to be checking those out for sure. And I will link as much as I can from what's available publicly online in the show notes. And obviously, I'll put your academia page there so people can go and find that. And so at the end of each podcast episode, I have two final questions I like to ask every single guest.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
And so you can kind of think of it in whatever perspective you need to. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer to these. So the first question is, what is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Wow. Oh my gosh. I didn't prepare for that question. The greatest legacy. Persia's amazing. It has these civilizations that are I mean, I studied Akkadian and ancient Mesopotamia, and you have all of these things in Mesopotamia rivaled in Persia. And I'm not sure people who study the ancient Near East particularly always give as much credit to Persia as they should. But what would be the greatest legacy? No, that one's really hard. It's so central to many things. It's even, very central for the language I study, Aramaic. The, various scripts move from Aramaic into Persia or shifted along through Persia. Yeah, at all points of the history of Aramaic that I study, there's always Persia there with something going on that relates to Aramaic. All along the way, even when you get to the Eastern Christian saints in the Syriac dialect of Aramaic, they're living in Persian-controlled regions, and Syriac text involving these Eastern Christian saints are not well published. There's so many that are not, but they're interacting with Zoroastrians and Persians. Yeah, I don't know if that's quite a good answer, but I myself feel as if exactly that you have so much of Persia. You have to pay attention to Persia when you're studying Aramaic.
Yeah, I mean, just influence on sort of the cultures around them because you can't ignore them. That's definitely a valid answer. I mean, there's no right answer, and it's meant deliberately to be a very difficult question. So don't worry about that too much. And the final question I'm going to ask you is, what, in your opinion, would be the best legacy that we, as current scholars, right, can leave for future students of Iranian studies, but also scholars who might not be in the field of Iranian studies, but need to work with Persian material?
That's another difficult one, but I would say, and this is the lover of the ancient world in me. I think modern folks quite often just disregard history, just disregard the long series of events that get us today to the place where we are today. There is politically in the US quite often this, anti-Iranian sentiment without understanding a whole lot of complexity and a long history to the present day. And I do think that studying the ancient world makes you understand your modern world so much better. I don't know, that probably sounds very elitist. Hey, an academic says, you should study history.
It's okay. I say that all the time, and I'm not a professor, so I still think it's true because it does help us understand ourselves and the world around us. So I would agree with your answer at least.
Yeah, I think it's very shallow. A lot of our modern world is very shallow. People don't have an attention span anymore. I like movies. My students like very short excerpts on social media, on YouTube, or wherever you can look at things. And they want the fast rundown quite often. And this is, those who join my department, Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at Penn State, of course, they're more interested in learning something about the ancient world. But I do think everyone's attention span is is getting shorter and shorter. And this includes me because I scroll through my phone all the time. And that's not a service to us.
I'm guilty of that too, so it's okay. Yes, I recognize. So yeah.
When I teach, I recently learned that people have, when you're lecturing, an 11-minute attention span. So you got to break it up every 11 minutes, which I sometimes forget to do. But that seems funny because isn't it for people who go to college, or for anybody, it's a skill to, listen, right?
Yeah. Gotta work on our active listening skills. The world has changed so much, hasn't it?
And you're doing a podcast, so of course you understand people listen. And you're reaching people who want to listen, or they can listen to this in short excerpts if they have to.
Exactly. That's right. Because I was like, well, I think I would hope, right, that people sit down and listen to the full hour. But, even again, that's always a discussion, even when starting podcasts. You're like, well, do you make it an hour? Because can people sit through an hour conversation? Do you make it 45 minutes? Do you make it a half hour? These are all decisions that definitely play into, the wider problems I think that everyone faces when trying to educate. It's how long can people sit and just listen to something? So no, I would definitely agree, but I would also say yes, I will endorse your answer of we have so much great material, we are always learning more, and if we can encourage people to learn more while they have the chance in school, then hopefully they will find some enjoyment in that.
And if they care about the Bible, learning history is vital.
Yes, it's very paramount.
And literary context, historical context for biblical studies is really, really important. And Persia is very important to biblical studies.
Yes, I would definitely endorse that. And I'm not just saying that because this is a show called Legacies of Ancient Persia. It is very true. So, oh man, there's so much that I didn't get to that I wanted to. I kind of had a short list, but I was like, I gotta go where things flow. And I definitely wanted to ask you so much more. So maybe I'll get a chance in the future to do so. But I want to thank you for taking the time to come and be a guest on our show. And I hope that this will have sparked some questions, and I hope people will maybe email you with some questions of their own.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. This was fun. It was great to meet you.
Of course, definitely. Thank you so much. Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.